It is time for Ask This. You've been sending in your questions. That there is Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government. Thank you very much, Jill, for joining us this afternoon. Now, I'll crack on because we've had a lot of questions. Okay. Start with Sadie Brown, who says, as the law stands right now, we still leave at 11 o'clock on the 29th of March. What actually has to be done in Parliament to change that? Because we're all working on the basis that Brexit has been delayed, but legally, at the moment, it hasn't, has it?
Yeah. Sadie's absolutely right, it's not been delayed yet. So what the government's got to do next week is introduce a new regulation, a statutory instrument that has to be approved by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords to change that date. Question, do they change it to the 12th of April or to the 22nd of May? The important thing is that it's not the 29th of March. Otherwise, we'll find that while we're still a member of the EU, as far as the EU is concerned, we're not actually in compliance with the EU treaties in UK law. So it needs to do that. That should be relatively easy, 1.5 hour debate, but needs consent from both the House of Lords and House of Commons.
Oh, those words, relatively easily. Jill, another one from Mike Mears. Is there any reason why the UK cannot revoke Article 50 before next week and then invoke it again to take effect in, say, 6 months or a year? Obviously, this huge petition that's running at the moment is calling for the revocation of it.
Yes, so let's leave aside the politics of whether the government wants to do that. And it's one thing Theresa May absolutely ruled out when she was asked to list her preferences last night. Technically, the UK can unilaterally revoke. That was the judgment in a court case that various sort of members of the Scottish Parliament and others brought. And the EU said, no, the UK can revoke unilaterally, but it can only revoke unilaterally if it's intending to stay as an EU member. So that means that if we say revoked unilaterally and just said, actually, we need to buy ourselves another 2 years, then wrote that Article 50 letter straight away afterwards, that would clearly be breaching the terms of that judgment. And the Commission Council would take us to the European Court of Justice and say, actually, that wasn't in good faith. You can't do that. You've not met the terms of that judgment. Much harder to judge, though, if we sort of hummed and hawed for quite a long time about whether we actually were intending to stay in the EU or not. So, and some people think, you know, how enforceable would that condition be, that this was revocation in order to stay an EU member? Because
there are lots of terms around, but if we revoke Article 50 and we can do it unilaterally, that means we stay in the EU on the terms that we are in it at the moment.
That's exactly right. So we'd stay with our budget rebate, we'd stay with all the opt-outs we've negotiated from things like, you know, the EU's border-free arrangement, the Schengen agreement, we wouldn't have to join the euro. So all those years of opt-outs we've negotiated would still stay in place. So it would just be like we'd never had any of this sort of Brexit fuss at all. We'd just go on being an EU member as before. Technically, of course, I mean, politically, there's quite a lot of water under the bridge, but technically that would be like that.
Now, on a theme, Dennis Hicks says, if the UK extends Article 50, which at the moment the EU, as of last night, says it can, does it retain or lose the right to revoke Article 50 and unilaterally decide to stay in the EU?
No, we don't lose it. As long as we're an EU member, we have the right to revoke Article 50. So any time up until the moment we leave. There is a complication, though, which is this point about European Parliament elections. Remember, one of the things that dictated those timelines that the EU put into the Council conclusions last night, so that 12th April date, 22nd of May, was they don't want to run the risk that the UK hangs on in there as an EU member state when it should have been running European Parliament elections or should be sending MEPs off to Strasbourg and Brussels. So that is a complication, and that would have to be sorted out somehow, because they're very worried that that would interfere with the EU's own internal legal order and mean that, for example, the European Parliament wouldn't be a valid institution and things like that. So it will cause a whole bunch of headaches, but I think that we can still do that because we have a unilateral right to revoke, and there's nothing that judgment said about the timing. But there would have to be a lot of sort of fancy footwork to work out how on earth you would rectify that position.
Right. Now, David Hunter sent this question, and forgive me, Jill, I'll put it to you. Is it known how many of the EU member nations would countenance an extension of Article 50 and whether that would they would allow time beyond June? He's asking you to second-guess 27 member states, but what's the sense?
Let's do bits of second-guessing here. I think there are very varied views, and it would depend. And one of the reasons why the EU has put this line in about you can extend beyond 22nd of May, but you need to have a plan and you need to participate in those elections. But if we say, yeah, we'll participate in the elections and we have a plan, then the EU has said it is definitely open to that. That was one of the things Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, said last night. Donald Tusk has always been willing to entertain a long extension. So that's one in your long extension camp. The Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has always also been in the long extension camp. Basically suits Ireland very well to hold open as long as possible the possibility that the UK decides to revoke or decides not to continue with Brexit or goes into as much softer Brexit sort of arrangement. At the other end, there are definitely one or two EU members who seem to be in the camp of, well, much as we'd have liked them to stay, actually we just can't bear much more of this. Let's get it over and done with. There were stories last night that the French President Emmanuel Macron had said, just give them a flat deadline, you're out by the 7th of May, well before the deadline the Prime Minister had been talking about on the 30th of June. So I think what we saw last night was the EU throughout the Article 50 negotiations has been impressively unified. Last night we saw that actually this issue of how to treat the UK, whether to try and expedite a rapid exit or to play it longer, really was a much more divisive issue. But they did manage to reach an agreement. So I think they would reach an agreement in the end. But a lot would depend on what they think the UK would be like hanging in there. There's quite a lot of worry, I think, particularly from the French, that a UK on its way out but still hanging around in the institutions and whatever could actually be not a very comfortable person to have sitting in lots of council meetings with a commissioner, lots of MEPs. Well, you can
sort of sympathise with that view, can't you?
I think it's understandable.
Yes, indeed. Jill, Graham Knowles, now, are we sure Theresa May will bring, he says MV3, but the meaningful vote, to the Commons next week for the third time?
So the two things we're not completely sure about. The agreement she reached and signed off with the EU yesterday certainly implied she would, because it talked about next week being the critical date to trigger that 22nd of May deadline. And certainly in her press conference, she gave the impression that she would, but that hasn't been confirmed. We haven't seen what the business of the House looks like for next week. The other slight problem is she may have to manage this problem with the Speaker, because remember, earlier this week, the Speaker threw her plans to have another meaningful vote, MV3, this week into disarray by saying you're not allowed to bring back the same question and ask MPs again. When he was making his announcement on the floor of the House on Monday, we were all screaming at the TV, ask him if he would regard a change to the exit day as a significant change that would allow the government to bring this back. But annoyingly, no MP asked him that. So it's just possible that the government would have to try and use some procedural device to make sure that the Speaker did allow them to schedule MV3 next week.
It's funny, there were lots of us shouting at the screen at the same time asking the same question. But it's interesting that the change of date could be that enough of a change. But I'm running out of time, Jill. So one more question from Ian Braithwaite. And this is very pertinent to what we've been talking about today. How will Parliament react to the interest in the revoke 50 petition, which we've just reported has hit beyond the 3 million mark? Will a party or an MP sponsor a debate to try to propose amendments based on it? Or will it just get discussed at a petition review committee, i.e. written off in effect? But at some point, does it change things when more than 3 million people are starting to sign a petition like this?
It certainly will affect a lot of the political optics, and expect lots of references, I would have thought, to that petition when we finally get round. So where might MPs debate it? I think there are stories going around that I think an SNP MP may be trying to get an emergency debate about the petition. And one of the things, if there is a big petition on that website, then that can be tagged in a relevant debate. So it can be brought to the attention of members, though I don't know that they absolutely need that being done on the case of this petition, that there is a very well-supported petition on an issue. So that can be tagged. I think if we got to those indicative votes, you had Greg Clark just before I came on talking about government scheduling that. one of those options that they might be looking at would be revoking Article 50, and I think you would find that petition tagged in any debate like that. So I don't think the people who are signing that petition need worry that MPs won't be noticing, though of course people would say those may of course be 3 million of the 16+ million who voted Remain last time. It's not until it gets well over 16 odd million that we realise that actually the balance of opinion in the country is changing.